August 1, 2022 Observer Newsletter. Vince McMahon resigns from WWE, by Observer staff. At 77, time for me to retire. Thank you, WWE Universe. Then. Now. Forever. Together #WWE #thankful. Vince McMahon at 1:05 p.m. Eastern Time on July 22, 2002, marking the end of an era in this business and 53 years working in the pro wrestling industry. Vincent Kennedy McMahon, the single most important figure in the history of pro wrestling, perhaps the most important figure there will ever be in this business, was forced out of the world he heavily shaped due to allegations of sexual misconduct. The allegations have led to the Securities and Exchange Commission and federal prosecutors launching inquiries into $14.6 million in payments to a number of women dating back to 2006. McMahon had shaped the modern wrestling landscape for the last 39 years, turning WWE into a company that grossed in excess of $1 billion and making it a television and entertainment powerhouse. He had battles with various competitors in wrestling over the years, losing some battles, but prevailing in every war. He had been a controversial and polarizing figure. He ruffled feathers everywhere with how he changed the industry. He was at times the most hated person in wrestling, but on the flip side, he changed so many lives for the better. The reaction to his leaving was notable, with so many praising him and thanking him. McMahon was a tireless worker, an incredible promoter, at times a creative genius, and at other times a beneficiary of both luck and timing. In recent years, as television viewership changed and consumption became more fragmented, his ability to be able to guarantee good numbers 2 nights a week in prime time and having an audience that would follow it to streaming properties trying to build their brands, led to rights fees that guaranteed huge profitability. WWE's popularity had its ups and downs, with its real peaks being in the 1984 to 1991 period during the heyday of Hulk Hogan, and again from 1998 to 2001, when he had Steve Austin and The Rock. While the modern business doesn't have that level of popularity, it is more important to television than ever before and more culturally acceptable in other ways, with more business and media partners than even in its heyday. Others felt that all the praising him at a scandal-driven exit looked, noting bigger players than McMahon being ousted for sexual misconduct hardly got that kind of reaction, was badly timed at best. The reality is that both sides of McMahon have to be acknowledged. He changed lives, some for the worst, many for the better. All of those who did publicly praise him on the way out knew that McMahon himself and the platform he created had led to their celebrity status. Even those who had very good reasons to dislike him recognized that their current lives wouldn't be as good, whether from a standpoint of being able to make money off their fame, or money earned from wrestling, had there been no McMahon. Even for myself, it's jarring and reflective. I've spent 40 years chronicling his successes, and his misdeeds, and everything in the middle. But any talk of McMahon and his legacy would be missing any sort of perspective if you labeled it largely all good, or largely all bad. He was ruthless. He had his controversies in and out of the ring. His interviews with Bob Costas and Armin Katayan saw him come across poorly. At other times he could be charming. He could also be a contradiction, always saying he encouraged dissenting opinions and then being furious at any second-guessing of his decisions to the point it was his yes man who flourished and those who had dissenting opinions were taught to keep quiet or they would risk losing their jobs. He was all-powerful, yet over the years he would defer to top talent, whether it was Hulk Hogan, Shawn Michaels, Ultimate Warrior, Brock Lesnar and others to the point, particularly with the latter three, people couldn't understand why he did so. After the revelation that his roster that brought the company to prominence in the 80s was loaded on steroids, he did a public about-face and said that they were going to have the strictest and most thorough steroid testing and policy in all of sports. Then he hired back Ultimate Warrior, who failed multiple tests, wasn't ever suspended, and he himself, after vowing he would never touch them again, continued to use them, at times to the point of ridiculousness as he aged. He faced a number of scandals having to do with allegations of ring boys coerced into sexual acts by the head of the ring crew, Mel Phillips, or allegations against Terry Garvin in talent relations, which led to both leaving the company in 1992. The questions were, what did he know? He had fired Phillips once and brought him back. There were similarities in this story, perhaps not as widespread, with McMahon in his role and Joe Paterno, the famed Penn State football coach, in his. Paterno, perhaps the greatest college football coach of all time, ended his life in disgrace. McMahon had a rough time, but continued to flourish because wrestling benefited by being something the media wasn't going to take seriously. The business was built in the 80s on steroids and marketed heavily to children. But so were action stars in Hollywood. He was indicted for steroid distribution and acquitted in a 1994 case that really shouldn't have gone to trial. However, had Linda McMahon not been tipped off about Dr. George Zaharian being hot, being the subject of an investigation with a raid of his office on the way, and the company had hired Zarian, knowing he was a steroid dealer since he sent shipments of steroids directly to McMahon. The trial result would have been different, as with the history of wrestling. Had WCW not creatively imploded and recognized the need to push more younger stars, had Ted Turner not lost power, if there was no Steve Austin or The Rock, the history of pro wrestling would have been written very much differently. The reality is that life, all of it, is about luck, situations, and opportunities. You can make things happen, work hard, and be very good at what you do, but without the right timing and luck, chance meetings, everything ends up differently. Vince's 80s success came with luck and timing, but he was more on the ball in the big picture than his rival promoters. He still had a huge advantage based on New York, with the national media, and with running Madison Square Garden. During the key part of the 80s war in 1984 to 85, he had his shows on both USA and TBS, and highly rated specials on MTV, where he became the hot brand in much of the country. A later deal with NBC and the success of WrestleMania put him on top, a position he held until 1996, and regained in 1998, never to lose it again. Vince screwed Vince. For 40 years, people have wanted to take Vince McMahon down. Whether it was the old guard promoters who worked with both he and his father, the government, Turner Broadcasting, or people in other industries he went into to take over, and failed in those industries, but he always remained king in wrestling. The irony as the story ends is that the person who took Vince McMahon down was Vince McMahon. He came from an era where things were very different. Plenty of big-time executives and entertainment figures, many bigger culturally than McMahon, because of their power and celebrity status, had access to women. And in trying to keep up the public image of a marriage, women got paid off in many cases. We've had presidents in this boat. And it goes both ways. Sometimes it's the man using his power. Sometimes it's the women using their own power on powerful people in hopes to get ahead. The dynamics are different in every case. Vince McMahon was a known womanizer, and even being married, it played out on our television screens. In 2001, he admitted to it but said because it hurt people, he would never do it again. That was the same statement as he made in 1992 when it came out in the trial of Dr. George Zarian that he had been taking steroids, also hardly a secret, and he claimed that in fact he did for a time and he got them from Zarian, but he didn't feel natural and would never do so again. What was commonplace in one era wasn't acceptable in another. But obviously, since these cases continued and there appear to have been repeated issues and serious lines crossed, that when things changed, he stayed the same. It's hard for people to change their lifestyle, and when they are incredibly rich and believe they answer to no one. Until Levesque lost power and had his heart issues, where we are now was expected to happen inevitably. Vince was getting older. Many wanted him to step down, especially a few years ago when the feeling was NXT was the stronger product and putting on better shows. But after the events of the past year, it seemed like what was expected wouldn't happen. But then in a matter of weeks, it all happened as it was thought to really for the last 20 years, with Stephanie McMahon and Levesque in charge. The industry is in an entire different state because of Vince McMahon. There is no way to really understate his influence. Because of so much time and so many twists and turns, it's impossible to ascertain where pro wrestling would be if he wasn't around. The territorial system that he sped up the demise of was going to be gone either way. He did kill the territories and change the system, but in the long run, had he not done it, it would have happened, just slower, and likely with someone less on the pulse of the public in charge, and probably wrestling wouldn't have grown to the heights it did. You could argue that the old system with all the live events and local flavor and stars was superior. But that couldn't last with a changing landscape. The reality is that even before 1984, a number of key promotions, such as the West Texas Group, Northern and Southern California, had died and others were on the way down, and had seen better days. Some were also hot, but national television would have led to the top talent congregating in one or two places. None would have taken the financial risks McMahon did that ended up making celebrities out of the 80s stars. None would have gotten on NBC. None would have had the success doing closed-circuit major shows at the level McMahon did, and probably would have taken longer to get on pay-per-view. Wrestlers' salary structures would not have grown the way they did with the other promoters because the revenue wouldn't have been there. But there would be wrestling. Internationally, perhaps other countries and places like Mexico, Puerto Rico, the UK, Germany, and even Japan could have survived and certainly could have been stronger with their own wrestling had not the bright lights of WWF television being in their market made the average person think they were just local wrestlers and not the biggest worldwide stars, as fans believed their local stars to be before WWF got television. In the US and Canada, there were probably only going to be a few survivors, most likely between 1 and 3, and just by the nature of every promotional war on a regional basis, the odds actually were that one would win that war and the rest would disappear, although there would always be much smaller non-competitive alternatives in some form. On a major business level, that would have happened after the biggest competitors at the time of his expansion all started seeing their businesses fall because they couldn't compete with the star power, production and overall aura of McMahon's product. Bill Watts had to sell. Verne Gagne went out of business. If it wasn't for Ted Turner, there would have been no real national alternative after the fall of Jim Crockett Promotions in 1988. Aside from the period from 1996 to 98 when McMahon was legitimately challenged by an Eric Bischoff-led WCW, which outdid him in creativity, he was the dominant force. After the death of WCW, McMahon was never challenged as Dixie Carter's TNA, a money-losing proposition was the alternative, largely due to Spike TV keeping the company alive and giving them primetime television. Once TNA lost Spike, they never died, but their significance waned greatly. Ring of Honor and then NJPW were briefly a very distant number 2 in the marketplace, at least in the ability to draw fans to live shows, and AEW became the biggest competition since early 1999. But WWE was so financially powerful and such a major brand not just in North America, but in many places around the world, that it looked to be almost impossible to unseat as the premier brand. The Levesque version of NXT was put in place to try and draw the type of fans that had given the workrate groups a following. But even with AEW's success, WWE still produced 12 times the revenue. McMahon grew up in North Carolina with his mother, who had a split up with Vincent James McMahon. His older brother Roderick, who recently passed away, lived with Vincent James. Vince, when he got into wrestling, was called Vince Jr., or just Jr., by everyone. It was a name he hated so much that he banned second-generation wrestlers who were named after their fathers that were wrestlers from using Jr. in their ring names. But he grew up and lived with Mother Vicky and stepdad Leo Lupton, who he hated. Born August 25, 1945, one of the funniest conversations I had with him was in 1991, about a week earlier, where they had booked Radio City Music Hall for a big birthday party for him. He brought up his birthday and I asked how old he was, and he joked 19 and then said 45, 46, I honestly don't know. I asked him, well, what year were you born? He said 1945, so I said that makes you 46. And he said, I guess you're right. He went to military school, where he wasn't nearly the renegade he claimed to have been in later versions of his life. He went to high school at Fishburne Military Academy in Waynesboro, Virginia, where he wrestled at 185 pounds and played baseball. One of his classmates, Tom Sullivan, later wrestled as Luscious Johnny Valiant. He graduated from East Carolina University with a business degree in 1968. He didn't meet his father until he was 12. He started working for his father at 24, running small house shows in Maine, and was the ring announcer on the television show. At 25, his father put him, with almost no notice, on television when the famed announcer Ray Morgan made financial demands, and his father fired him and told his son, with no experience, to go out there. His father then replaced Bill Cardiel as the announcer on his other show with his son. His son wasn't good at first, but grew into the role. He was never the best at play-by-play, but he excelled in other aspects, such as getting characters over, especially on interviews, with his facial expressions of admiration for the top babyfaces, and disgust at the top heels. He was never viewed in the 70s as the best announcer, but after many years on the job, you could argue he was the most effective. While not a secret, the idea that the television announcer owned the company was never talked about. There were a few bits on television, such as saying good guys and bad guys in wrestling were passé in the mid-90s, even though nearly 30 years later they are still there, where he would be on wrestling shows as the owner. He also did so talking about the media and prosecutor Sean O'Shea being out to get him and failing after his 1994 steroid distribution trial. It really didn't become part of storylines until 1996, when he pretended that Bret Hart's decision to return to WWF was unknown to him as he interviewed Hart on Raw, and after the Survivor Series screw job the next year when he tried to babyface himself in explaining what happened, and when that backfired, was convinced by Vince Russo to become a heel character in 1998. He became one of the greatest heel characters and on-screen out-of-the-ring performers in history as Mr. McMahon, with a landmark program with Steve Austin. It's hard to fathom that if it was Crockett left standing that he'd have been anywhere near as successful, or even able to expand successfully all over the country. McMahon's expansion, which started when he started promoting in Los Angeles with the death of the LaBelle promotion in 1982, really took shape in 1983 even if many didn't see it coming. McMahon had purchased Capital Sports, better known as the World Wrestling Federation, from his father in 1982. He made a $250,000 down payment, and then had to pay another $250,000 down on 3 more occasions, totaling $1 million. Or he would renege on the deal and the company would be back in the hands of the former ownership. He used company profits to make the other 3 payments. A $1 million price tag, far less than the company grossed in 1 year in Madison Square Garden alone, seems ridiculously tiny given the company was likely grossing 7 to 10 times that figure each year. But it was a different era. In doing so, he controlled the strongest territory in the country, running major cities like New York with its 3 major arenas at the time: Boston, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Providence, and other smaller markets. The company also made money from local cable systems, which paid them extra for live television rights to shows monthly in Madison Square Garden and the Spectrum in Philadelphia. The USA Network, when it started, was a national version of the MSG network, and would air the MSG shows on a tape delay. So that was the company's beginnings of national exposure. He had a checkered business career before this time. He and his wife filed for bankruptcy at one point after being part of the promotion of the money-losing Evel Knievel Snake River Canyon Jump closed-circuit fiasco. He purchased the Cape Cod Coliseum and also owned a minor league hockey team and promoted rock concerts, learning from all of them aspects of promotion and entertainment. Even after his WWE success, he had failures in promoting a Rolling Stones pay-per-view show, boxing pay-per-view, 2 incarnations of the XFL, and the World Bodybuilding Federation. He also tried a music company and had mixed results in doing a movie company. He spent close to $100 million financing his wife in 2 separate runs for the U.S. Senate, but his wife ended up in Donald Trump's cabinet and became a staunch supporter of his, while the company steered as clear as it could from divisive politics after Trump won the election. They never bragged that the president was a WWE Hall of Fame member or that he was the biggest draw in the most purchased pay-per-view show they would ever put on. Joe Blanchard, the promoter of Southwest Championship Wrestling, paid the USA Network for an early morning time slot. National cable television wrestling had started in 1976 when Ted Turner created the Superstation and got cable systems around the country to air his WTCG, the famed Channel 17 in Atlanta. By sheer coincidence, one of the staples, and actually the highest nationally rated show on the station in its early days, was Georgia Championship Wrestling. By 1981, it was available in 30 million homes, and the Saturday show did an average 6.4 rating and the Sunday show averaged a 6.6 rating. Wrestling was the first cable show to hit 1 million homes nationally on a regular basis, and again 2 million. Blanchard saw cable as the future with the idea that with a national outlet, he could expand his promotion into new markets. But he didn't have the quality of show or talent to pull that off, and the cost of the time slot put him deeply in red ink and led to his company closing down. After a controversial angle where USA didn't want his product on the air, and he was also behind in paying for his time slot, the show was canceled. But USA was getting strong ratings in the time slot. McMahon, who had the relationship because USA was airing MSG shows, took the paying for time deal that Blanchard had and created a show called All-American Wrestling. The concept was that the show would air main event stars in squash matches from the different regional television shows. Other promoters would supply tapes of their biggest stars with the idea that fans on a national basis would see their stars and local fans would see their stars on a national station. The focus was, of course, on McMahon's talent and WWF. But the wheels were in motion. McMahon, his father, and Jim Barnett, who they had hired after he had to leave Georgia Championship Wrestling, the company he had been running since 1974 after returning from Australia, in an embezzlement scandal, all quit the NWA at the 1983 convention. The birth of WWF as we know it took place on December 27, 1983. St. Louis was considered the strongest wrestling city in the country outside of McMahon's territory. It had a rich history, crafted first by Tom Pax and later Sam Muchnick, who had retired 2 years earlier. It was the NWA's flagship city. Muchnick retired and sold his stock to Bob Geigel, Vern Gagne, Harley Race, and Pat O'Connor. Larry Matuszek, the protege of Muchnick, was to run the company as general manager. Matuszek wanted to run it like the successful Muchnick St. Louis. His partners ran it like they had run Kansas City, a far less successful city that was the main city in one of the weaker territories in the country, Heart of America Promotions, known as Central States Wrestling. Because of the proximity to St. Louis, the St. Louis undercards were filled with Central States talent. Geigel had been a partner and O'Connor and Matuszek were co-bookers of St. Louis. Matuszek quit and ran opposition, but closed up after issues with his financial backers, Delaware North. KPLR-TV, which had great success with the legendary Wrestling at the Chase show, saw ratings decline under Geigel and made the decision to cancel the show. Attendance had fallen as well. McMahon saw St. Louis as a statement maker, going into what had often been the NWA's best market and best paying city. KPLR-TV from an historical standpoint, because of Mushnick, had one of the most successful television runs of any station in the country with pro wrestling. Matuszak and McMahon both got wind of the fact they could get what was one of the most popular wrestling time slots in the country. A meeting was held with both of them. The station's general manager, Ted Koppler, whose father had made the original deal with Mushnick, one of the two to work together. He noted McMahon had a supply of top talent and an impressive track record of selling out Madison Square Garden, while Matuszak had been a success as a booker and with his connection with Mushnick, was well respected in the market and was the local television voice of wrestling. McMahon offered the station $2,100 per week for the slot, a huge figure at the time, and they would also use the station to help produce their syndicated television show, so the station would make money and get more work as well. They would also get 5% of the house shows. McMahon agreed to partner on the venture with Matuszak, only for Barnett to call him and change the agreed-upon deal to a weekly salary but no percentage. Unlike in Los Angeles, which had no local promotion any longer, McMahon debuted in St. Louis, a market that had a local promotion with ownership that included Gagne, who had the second or third strongest territory himself. Hulk Hogan, the biggest drawing card Gagne ever had, gave notice to the AWA. Still, he was advertised for shows after he had done so. On December 27th in St. Louis, Hogan, as a babyface, Phil Roddy Piper, who had been one of Jim Crockett's biggest stars, David Schultz, Hogan's top AWA rival at the time, and Gagne's cult favorite announcer and interviewer Gene Okerlund, were all at the WWF taping. The war was on. Hogan was already the biggest individual drawing card on the U.S. scene working for Gagne, who didn't have him under contract. He was an even bigger cultural star in Japan, where New Japan Pro Wrestling was one of the top-rated shows on television. Piper, as Hogan's adversary, became the most important heel in the company for the next 2 years and a very key part in selling the first WrestleMania. There were many chapters. McMahon's expansion had strong results in some places, weaker results in others, as he promoted in markets with existing promotions. In some markets, he went to the television station, offered to pay them to air his tape, and in many markets, gave the station a percentage of the gates from the live shows. In most of those places, the local promotion would give the tape to the station for free. The station got highly rated programming to sell ads on that didn't cost them a thing. Some promoters paid the station a small percentage of the gates on the live show so the station would help in promoting the events. By doing so, McMahon would get the time slot wrestling fans were most used to watching on a local basis. Most of the stars from the other promotions he was featuring on All American Wrestling, he made offers to come to his company. The promoters who thought McMahon was their friend doing them a favor by sending him tapes found out McMahon was actually looking at taking their talent, their local time slots, and promoting against them. McMahon made offers to Gagne and others to buy their territories, basically saying they could sell or he was going to promote against them. The offers were considered embarrassingly low to most. However, in Canada he brokered deals with Jack Tunney, who ran Toronto, the country's historically biggest market, and Stu Hart, getting both men's television time. The Hart deal was for $1 million, paid in 10 annual installments of $100,000. After 1 year, when he had gotten all of their TV stations, he never paid the second installment, claiming Hart had breached his no-compete deal when Bruce Hart had promoted an independent show during that year. But he maintained the relationship with Stu Hart, saying he could reopen Stampede Wrestling, but now Vince had the key time slots, and Hart would still get a percentage of WWE events in Edmonton and Calgary. The most important deal was purchasing Georgia Championship Wrestling. This was a crazy deal. Alan Rogowski, better known as Ole Anderson, was running the company after ousting Barnett. Jack and Gerald Briscoe were minority shareholders. At first they pushed Barnett to go national because their television show was so popular. Barnett did expand into Ohio and Michigan, the Sheik's old territory, but his company was pretty much done by that time, although Sheik still resented them coming into his territory. But he was unwilling to go into markets that had an NWA affiliate, telling the Briscoes that they were his friends. The Briscoes insisted that they weren't. Then GCW started losing money for a variety of reasons. The Briscoes saw that the future didn't look bright and scheduled a secret meeting with McMahon. They rounded out other shareholders to get more than 50%. McMahon agreed to a $750,000 deal for the company, the key being McMahon would get the most popular national television outlet, the Saturday and Sunday shows on WTBS, which WTCG changed its station letters to. Besides the Briscoes, Jim Oates, who had financed most of Barnett's business dealings from the 50s since the two were close from college, still had points. Rogowski had no idea any of this happened until he was told McMahon had bought the majority interest in his company and was shutting it down. There were some court fights, with McMahon's deal standing up. So McMahon had both TBS and USA, while at the same time getting wrestling mainstream with rock star Cyndi Lauper and TV star Mr. T doing angles, and the emergence of Hogan, Piper and others, plus having Andre the Giant, the biggest attraction and best-known wrestler nationwide, working full-time for him. He had all the national outlets. These expansions left him deeply in the red. He banked everything on the first WrestleMania, with the idea of running closed circuit in 200 arenas around the country, with Hogan and Mr. T against Piper and Paul Orndorff, plus using celebrities like Lauper, Billy Martin, Muhammad Ali, Liberace and many others. The story is if Mania had failed, the company would have had to close up. A week before, with advances lagging, Ed Cohen had to cancel roughly one-third of the closed-circuit locations, and the advances in many others were bad. However, with a fantastic week of promotion, headlined by Hogan and Mr. T on Saturday Night Live, the walk-up was tremendous, not everywhere, but in enough places where more than 400,000 fans, which they later claimed to be 1 million, attended, which was more than profitable. While McMahon did have money-losing years in the mid-90s, the success of the first WrestleMania, and his landing a deal with NBC and Dick Ebersol to have regular Saturday night's main event shows on NBC, which did incredible numbers, actually beating Saturday Night Live numbers the first few years, led to the huge success. Still, financially, during the Hogan era, the company's biggest annual profits were $6 million, a far cry from the level of profits during the Austin Rock era and nothing compared to the numbers today. These were viewed by far more people than the cable shows were seen by, and made the wrestlers even bigger mainstream names, plus he was being paid for the content. McMahon also upped his price for sending talent to New Japan Pro Wrestling, although after doing so with him not sending top talent, that relationship fell apart shortly after, and when he was about to be kicked off TBS for declining ratings and sending in tapes when Turner wanted the shows taped in his studios in Atlanta, he sold the time slot to Crockett for $1 million. The Japanese and Crockett deals, along with the Mania revenue, allowed him to pay off the money he was behind. His television network nationally allowed him to sell national advertising. By 1985 the company was set, a success, and unchallenged #1, even if some of their competitors didn't realize it. Mania on closed circuit was successful overall but died in markets that still had strong local promotions, emboldening those promoters to think McMahon gave it his best shot, but his product wouldn't work in their neck of the woods, because the clientele of people like Crockett, Jerry Jarrett/Jerry Lawler, Paul Bosch/Bill Watts and others weren't going to accept his version of wrestling. And as big as Hogan was, and he was, there were places WWF had trouble drawing in for more than a decade. It really wasn't until 1998, and the rise of Steve Austin, where WWF was drawing big everywhere they went. After Mania, Ernie Ladd noted that the war was over and Vince won, but that most of the promoters hadn't figured that out. That was true. I spoke with a number of the stronger promoters of the time, and when Mania was not a success in their markets, they breathed a sigh of relief, knowing there was nothing stronger he could throw at them. But that was short-lived, because once McMahon got on NBC, his talent, not their talent, became the major league talent. And with the exception of Crockett, it was only a matter of time when all of them would take a financial hit because their live attendance fell for that very reason. And when it did, so did pay. So the top stars for everyone but Crockett wanted to work for Vince, especially when they heard that even prelim wrestlers could make $100,000 per year. McMahon liked to portray himself as the underdog in that fight, but he was based in New York, ran Madison Square Garden and headed the highest-grossing territory. He took major risks. He could have failed. But he was not the underdog. Eddie Einhorn tried to get all the other promoters to mobilize together against him, but that didn't work because they were all people who had their own ideas of how to do business and ran autonomously. The joke was when they got together, they would fight over where to get lunch. As a wrestling promoter, he was filled with contradictions and double standards, but that goes with any celebrity-fueled business. Most promoters had their dark sides, and wrestling was always a shady business from its inception. That was the world McMahon entered in 1970 as the son of Vincent James McMahon, and the world he flourished in as its most powerful figure for 39 years. Over the next few years that played out, Gagne lost his key talent early and his television was inadequate, although an ESPN deal paid him enough to survive a few years after people stopped attending his events. Watts tried to expand and had a strong television show, but not the star power, and sold to Crockett in 1987. Perhaps history would have changed when Ted Turner put Watts' show on the air in 1985 and the show quickly became the highest-rated show on cable. The idea was that they would become partners and Turner would help finance Watts' expansion. But after McMahon sold to Crockett and Turner had a wrestling show with Dusty Rhodes, Ric Flair and the Road Warriors on, he was happy with the deal and went exclusively with Crockett on his station until buying the company when Crockett failed. Crockett couldn't afford the expense of buying television time in new markets and was inconsistent drawing outside his territory. They were all living too high and not realizing how much money they were losing, and to avoid bankruptcy, sold to Turner for $9 million in 1988. WCW's television ratings weren't much different than WWF's on a national cable basis, but WWF converted their fans to customers going to shows and PPVs. And syndication was more important than cable. With the strongest syndication, McMahon was able to make money selling ads for his television to offset the costs of buying the time in many places, something no other promoter was able to do. Plus, he had Hogan, who was an incredible draw from 1984 until 1992. In time, the product got hot enough that he didn't have to buy time as much because stations saw value in the brand name. WWF also drew far more kids than WCW, and that was the future. WCW tried various ways to draw kids, but they never worked until the Nitro period. McMahon's company fell greatly after Hogan left full-time in 1992, and completely in 1993. Everything had been built around Hogan and nobody could follow him. When Hogan went to WCW, with Randy Savage, Piper and others, McMahon felt they were past their primes. Jerry Jarrett told him otherwise, that he made those people giant stars, and McMahon's feeling they couldn't be focused on after 40 was a mistake. WCW had its run-in with the NWO angle in 1996, until Austin and McMahon turned the tables in 1998. McMahon's company was number 2 in the US for the first time in its history and the only time one could argue since the 1970s and certainly since the 80s. But even then, it was still number 1 internationally. This led to another period of 24 years where McMahon was the undisputed king in WWF, later renamed WWE after losing a lawsuit to the World Wildlife Fund, was number 1 without any sort of real challenge. McMahon made cultural icons out of Hogan, started the run of Dwayne Johnson, which ended up with him being one of the biggest movie stars and celebrities in the world, and to a lesser extent, Undertaker, Levesque's Triple H, Randy Savage, Piper, John Cena, and brought a new level of fame historically for people like Andre the Giant. Wrestlers were able to make far more money than they even dreamed. While the stars flourished, others were spit up and chewed out with injuries, and in many cases drug addictions to do those injuries, having no retirement income or medical benefits. WWE did implement a policy where any talent who was ever under contract could get rehab paid for, and set up a program where they didn't just do rehab but kept up with the talent that was going through those issues. And there were also the pitfalls. The 80s talent had horrible schedules, which led to terrible drug issues in many cases, and the emphasis on bodies led to most using steroids. The death rate of wrestlers of that era due to heart attacks in particular was 7 times that of the population at large. There were the controversies. McMahon exploited the ongoing Gulf War for the 1991 WrestleMania, leading to a lot of negative press. Like in other cases, if it had been any other sports or entertainment owner, the press would have been far more, but wrestling was under the radar. The Owen Hart death in 1999 was the worst in-ring tragedy of his 40 years, and his reputation got even worse when he made the call to continue the show. The Chris Benoit murder of his wife and son and suicide in 2007 was one of the biggest news stories of that year, and WWE's response included being more concerned that steroids weren't involved, while tons of steroids were found at his home, because that contradicted and exposed flaws in their drug testing policy implemented when Benoit's best friend, Eddie Guerrero, died in 2005 of a heart attack with steroids and painkiller usage listed as a contributing cause. The steroid issue always followed him. Steroid use throughout pro wrestling was huge in the 80s, but it was bigger in WWF than anywhere. After the Zarian trial, due to media pressure in his home New York market, he implemented testing for steroids from 1992 to 1995. It was dropped when WCW brought in Hogan and company, and McMahon felt it was an unfair playing field. It was implemented again in 2005, which McMahon told talent after Guerrero died, and in theory, remains in place today. The second policy became an embarrassment of sorts when Benoit died, and it came out he had been on heavy dosages of testosterone due to an exemption he was given, and at death had a 59.4 to 1 TE ratio where 1 to 1 is normal and a figure above 4 to 1 is considered suspicious, and had 4 to 5 times what he should have had with testosterone replacement therapy in his system at the time of his death. A later government raid against Signature Pharmacy showed a client list that included about a dozen WWE stars who were getting steroids and growth hormone while testing was ongoing. As wrestlers got more money, usage of GH to beat the tests increased since, while it wasn't as bad as the 80s, Wrestlers were still being judged by McMahon on their bodies and looks, with the idea of who could be a major star and who were just guys who were good mechanics in the ring. Still, wrestling fans are going to watch what they perceive as Major League Wrestling regardless. The company took a hit for a short period when the Benoit story was all over the news, but eventually, as would always be the case, it got back to normal. In recent years, it was the controversial 10-year deal with Saudi Arabia. McMahon received far less criticism for that deal than pro golfers and Donald Trump and even President Biden have received of late for similar business dealings or talks. McMahon also went shortly after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the one time his deal was given some media scrutiny, and signed the deal even though many of his stars would not be allowed to participate due to reasons of gender and ethnicity, because the money figure was too high, upwards of $50 million per event, to turn down. But there was no doubt, with the money figure being what it was, and being a public company, that he would do everything to keep that deal. The hostage situation with the talent, which the company greatly attempted to cover up, and McMahon lashed out at talent that he perceived were responsible for the story getting out, and led to a $39 million lawsuit settlement to avoid discovery on that story, ended up being another aspect of making that deal. Still, the closest sports entity to WWE, the UFC's parent company Endeavor, divested itself of all Saudi revenue after the Khashoggi murder. The McMahon family became characters in the late 90s during the Attitude Era. Vince McMahon had been portrayed on television as the announcer through 1997, when, after the Bret Hart screwjob in the 1997 Survivor Series, he tried to explain his side publicly and explain why Bret was wrong. The famed "Bret screwed Bret" speech. That backfired on him, particularly when he insisted on saying, after Hart punched him and knocked him out backstage, and McMahon also broke his ankle in falling, that he had given Hart a free shot, and if it had been a real fight, the outcome, even at his age, he was 52, Hart was 40, would have been different. Wrestling fans didn't want to hear that the aging owner of the company could beat up the guy the company had portrayed to the fans as one of its biggest stars and a multi-time world champion. But in backfiring, this led to the creation of the heel Vince McMahon character, Mr. McMahon, one of the great heel performers of all time. The Mr. McMahon vs. Steve Austin catapulted the company into its biggest mainstream success from 1998 to 2001, a boom that largely ended when, in the most foolish of booking, Austin and McMahon shook hands, with Austin turning heel at the 2001 WrestleMania. Like with Bruno Sammartino, the company's hero in the 60s and 70s, and Hogan from 1984 to 92, Austin had brought a huge new influx of fans to WWE with the idea of the performer who would not fear and stand up and usually get the better of his ruthless, filthy rich boss. From a psychology standpoint, you could have turned anyone on the roster, and in those days almost every star switched from heel to face constantly, but Austin was the exception, and somehow McMahon missed what should have been the obvious. To be fair, Austin claimed the idea was his, but McMahon did go with it, and Austin has always claimed he should have given McMahon an impromptu stunner in the ring in Houston that night because it was such a bad idea. Vince, Linda, Stephanie, and Shane McMahon all became television characters. Linda was mostly a babyface and used the least because she was not good on camera. Stephanie and Shane varied from heel to face, with Stephanie more often a heel and Shane often a face. Internal on-screen family feuds were regular fare. Vince, Stephanie, Shane, and Triple H, at first the storyline husband of Stephanie and later the real-life husband, became the company's biggest television ratings movers along with Austin and The Rock. It was the most impressive period for television ratings the company would ever have. While Georgia Championship Wrestling in 1980 and 1981 drew higher actual ratings, cable was in its infancy and less homes were watching, and it's unfair to compare those numbers, just as how it's silly to compare Attitude Era numbers with today's numbers in any way past the Attitude Era due to Austin, Rock, and Vince, was a huge boom period. Vince booked himself in a tag team match against God. Vince came up with an angle where he would impregnate Stephanie, but she told her father she wasn't agreeable to that one. Vince booked his own death in a limo explosion, although eventually he was to come back. One person watching the show, future President Donald Trump, believed it to be real and in a panic contacted the family after watching that episode. That angle had to be dropped due to taste because right after it happened, Chris Benoit had killed his wife, his son and himself, and Vince could not pretend to be dead and had to address that publicly, plus even by WWE standards, continuing that would have been beyond the taste allowed. There were complaints by wrestlers, notably Mick Foley, that the angle was in bad taste in the first place given the number of real deaths of wrestlers fans had to deal with, and it coming right after the death of Sherry Martel. The company felt that was one of the reasons they had to do the angle, because wrestling fans had lived through so many tragedies in a short period of time and the death of Vince was topical. Even the family marriages had storyline ironies. Today's ultimate power couple, Stephanie and Paul, were first married in a storyline before they ever became a couple. Stephanie was engaged to Test, a wrestler played by Andrew Martin. But the idea was that Triple H drugged her in Las Vegas and married her. Initially she was disgusted, and somehow couldn't get out of it, but real-life logic rarely entered into angles in those days. Then she turned heel and sided with him. Later they got divorced in storyline. She later became head of creative, and brought in a large staff of writers to heavily script the television show after frustration when wrestlers going impromptu, notably Ric Flair, said things that they didn't want on television. Later they became a real-life couple and were married in 2003, and have 3 daughters. Vince had started a 2001 storyline where he and Linda would divorce. Vince frequently portrayed himself with the various hot women he employed. The idea was there in certain angles, but it was never done outright that McMahon was having affairs, as he was in real life. Triple H once noted on a show how Vince McMahon dates women so much younger than him. The angle started with Vince being caught with Tori Wilson with his pants supposedly down and Linda walked in the room. The idea was that Linda was going to file for divorce, and in the settlement, Linda would get control of Raw and give it to Shane, the babyface son, who had just purchased WCW from under the nose of his father. The Monday Night Show would then change its name from Raw to Nitro, the name of the WCW flagship show of that era. Ed Cohen had to redo schedules with the idea of touring WCW and WWF brands, with the WCW brand being called Shane McMahon's WCW, with the idea that with Shane, a babyface, WCW and Nitro would no longer be hated by the WWF fan base that had been taught during the Monday Night Wars to stand up for the company against the enemy that had stolen Vince's talent and used them against him. The irony, of course, being that the rise of WCW and taking people like Hogan, Piper, Savage, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash and many others was the exact business model McMahon employed in 1984 by offering more money and taking the top talent away from all the regional promoters. Vince would argue that it wasn't the same, because he legit risked everything on his expansion, while Ted Turner, who backed WCW, had so much money that he could afford to lose money. He even did television angles where he tried to rile up Turner's stockholders with the idea they were spending and wasting money on wrestling, to get stockholders to force WCW to shut down, before the period WCW actually became profitable for a few years. Ironically, that same thought process is in WWE today. Even though WWE is, from a revenue standpoint, probably a dozen times larger than AEW, WWE claims both the success of AEW in being competitive and even ahead at one point in live attendance, competitive with men 18 to 49 and doing big pay-per-view numbers, that they are the victims with a similar mentality. The idea is that they have to turn a profit for shareholders, while Tony Khan can lose money because AEW is a private company, and somehow that explains the revenue discrepancy being much larger than the ratings and live event gap. The Linda divorce angle ended in Tacoma, Washington, when the first tease of WCW on Raw segment with Booker T vs. Buff Bagwell with Scott Hudson and Arnold Anderson as announcers was a disaster. Mike Tenay was heavily considered for this role, and it's not clear what happened, although WWF was set to hire Tenay as the lead announcer for Nitro. This never happened because there never was a Shane McMahon Nitro. The Tacoma crowd hated everything WCW, as the WWF fan base had been taught. The next week, Raw was in Atlanta. Perhaps things wouldn't have been so bad in week 2, but Vince pulled the plug on the entire thing the next day. I can recall that night talking to a WWF VP and telling him Vince was going to pull the plug on the whole thing, even though it had only been one match. I was told point blank that after the failure of the XFL, the WWF simply could not afford from a public standpoint a second failure with the launch of WCW, since they had publicly talked of launching the new brand, and they had to make it work. The next day, Cohen, who had just rebooked the entire schedule for months, if not a full year with the purchase, had to rebook everything again immediately because they were not going to launch WCW as a separate brand. Vince also did a storyline with Trump where Trump would be a regular character as having purchased Raw from Vince. This led to a drop in the stock market price of company stock, with the belief that Trump would be a detriment as compared to McMahon in running the wrestling company. WWE would have to send out a release to stop the price drop, noting it was storyline, and then drop the angle, doing a storyline where Vince purchased Raw back and Trump made huge profit in the overall transaction. McMahon first started in pro wrestling as a house show promoter for his father in 1970, so he had 52 years as a promoter and 40 years owning a company. At 76, the belief was the only thing that could change that would be failing health or death. Frank Defford, the legendary sports writer who was very instrumental in my career, dealt with McMahon many times over the years. In his autobiography, He wrote about how of all the people he had ever met in his life, Rodney Dangerfield was the second worst, going into detail on him. Considering Defford met basically a who's who of sports personalities over 55 years, where he was generally considered the best sportswriter of the year, it takes a lot to be first on that kind of a list. But in following McMahon's career and more so personal interaction with him, McMahon shockingly was number one. Defford, in the book, noted that he was at the 40th birthday party for John Filippelli, who he had worked with when both did an NFL show together and were close friends. Filippelli was heading television for WWF at the time, so McMahon and Patterson were there. So they're in this country club bowling alley, and he described McMahon as acting maniacal, and then one of the people at the party was named Dick. Whenever it was his turn to bowl, McMahon and Patterson were acting like second graders, laughing about his name, talking about Dick as a metaphor for penises. Keep in mind that Vince was 46 at this time, Patterson was 50, Defford was 52, and that was the age range for most of the people at the party. The Filippellis were embarrassed and rolling their eyes at John's boss at the time. Patterson then stole one of Defford's shoes and one of his wife's shoes. When it was over, and the Deffords couldn't find their shoes, McMahon and Patterson were laughing about it. So they figured, okay, a joke, and waited for them to give it back. But they never gave up the shoes, and the Deffords had to go home still wearing their bowling shoes until they returned the bowling shoes later. And they were expensive shoes that were stolen. McMahon also sent him a Christmas card a few months later asking him if he had found his shoe. But what made Defford matter was McMahon claiming to a congressional committee that the article he had written in 2007 after the death of Chris Benoit, on all the young deaths in pro wrestling, was because he was holding a grudge against him for stealing his shoe 16 years earlier. When Defford found out that McMahon had said that before the congressional committee, he said, "I'm rather amazed that McMahon would bring this up, but it's a pretty accurate account of him acting like a horse's ass." Really weird. McMahon announcing his retirement at 76 came just 20 days after he had assured wrestlers at the Money in the Bank event in Las Vegas that he was not leaving, in spite of the allegations first made public by Ted Mann and Joe Palazzolo of the Wall Street Journal. With his official departure, which included departing from the board of directors, Nick Khan and Stephanie McMahon have taken over his duties as co-CEOs, with Khan continuing as company president. Paul Levesque returned as the head of talent relations and will be the person in charge of creative, overseeing Bruce Pritchard. While one would have thought the departure of McMahon would lead to a collapse of WWE stock, such as happened when McMahon had fired George Barrios and Michelle Wilson, the co-presidents, a few years back, the opposite was the case. The stock surged at first, amidst belief that with McMahon out, it opens the company for a sale to a major media conglomerate. Alan Gould of Loop Capital wrote to investors about this and upgraded the stock, which was the key leading to the rise. Even before McMahon left the company, there had been Wall Street talk of a potential WWE sale, which is one of the reasons the stock grew back to where it was after the initial drop after the first story came out. But the feeling is with McMahon out of the picture, a sale is far more likely. This is a challenging environment with the equities of most of the logical buyers depressed, but there is demand for live event programming, and it is the first time that one could realistically think that WWE could be for sale, said Gould, who has followed WWE very closely for years. Buyers could include Comcast, Disney, Amazon, and possibly Netflix, he wrote in a note to clients. With sports rights in high demand and surging in value, he called the franchise unique, with significant upside. We have been forecasting a 50% increase in television rights for Raw and SmackDown in 2024, which we believe could be conservative, especially if the linear deal is combined with the streaming deal which expires in early 2026. We estimate WWE currently receives about $1 per view hour, which compares with an estimated $3 to $4 per viewer hour for the NBA and NHL, leaving substantial room for upside. He also wrote about potential buyers. Comcast represents almost a third of WWE revenue, and CEO Brian Roberts has always prioritized long-term shareholder value. But especially after the $39 billion Sky acquisition, it may be tough to justify reducing the Comcast share buyback program to acquire WWE. Disney airs the UFC, and WWE could be strong companion programming with weekly shows. But its balance sheet is still stretched from the Fox acquisition and the pandemic, and it's got to pay $9 billion plus in January 2024 to buy the remaining third of Hulu from Comcast. Amazon has been buying more sports programming. Netflix, less likely as it has avoided sports and event programming, but WWE is a hybrid of entertainment and sports. It has a global following, runs 52 weeks per year, and is much lower cost than most sports programming. However, NFLX shares are down dramatically. Other analysts have mentioned the same companies, as well as Endeavor, which purchased UFC in 2016, a company with a lot of business similarities to WWE, as people who could be interested. Those in WWE also mentioned Fox, which isn't as cash-rich as the others, but has a great relationship and wanted Raw during the last round of negotiations only to have USA meet the Fox offer, and since they had the right to match an offer, Fox got SmackDown, which USA did not match the offer for. As far as what happens next, how creative changes, how the company changes, who stays, who goes, there are far more questions than answers. And if there is a sale, as we saw with the UFC sale in 2016, there will likely be a house cleaning and even more major changes. Khan will be in charge of the business end. Stephanie McMahon will be the public face of the company, and she and Levesque will handle the wrestling end. There is great irony in Stephanie McMahon and Levesque being the two most powerful people on the wrestling end. For years the belief was the two were the heir apparents to the kingdom. The co-CEO aspect is notable because from people who work with top executives and are top executives in this area, more often than not it doesn't work. There will be disagreements and neither has the full power to implement things. One person in WWE noted, "I actually believe this pairing is necessary." Nick is a revenue driver. And he's been involved in things that are not his specialty. What he's good at, he's great at. Steph is the promoter. The old school promoter with a new lexicon in media about analytics and branding. If Steph sticks to being a promoter, managing the relationships for the company, and Nick sticks to revenue, they're a formidable team. Levesque then lost power last year. He had some of his duties taken away from him, including John Laurinaitis taking over as head of talent relations, and then the decision was made by Vince McMahon and Nick Khan to change NXT completely to a developmental brand and to try and largely recruit to-tier athletes with good looks rather than then feature the top independent wrestlers that had built the brand. Levesque's version of NXT was critically acclaimed for years, particularly in putting on some of the best major events in company history. But once it got on television, things changed as it lost badly in a Wednesday night wrestling war with AEW. Then, after moving to Tuesday, ratings did not improve significantly with no wrestling competition, and eventually got worse. Levesque's attempt to market a young and hip version of the show ended up being the oldest audience of any wrestling show. Although when the changes were made to the new format based on better-looking people and fresher faces, but also inexperienced younger talent, the audience fell and grew even older to where most weeks half the viewership was over the age of 60. Shortly after the NXT change, Levesque nearly died from heart problems. NXT went on without him, with Shawn Michaels as the key creative force. Stephanie McMahon then announced she was taking a temporary leave of absence, and then her position as chief brand officer was replaced. While her departure was voluntary and she had been talking about it for months, if and when she returned, it was clear she was going to be put in a different position. And then there were those in the company who put out word that she wasn't good at her job, basically burying her, including a story that portrayed her departure as a decision made by Vince McMahon. She was not expected back anytime soon. But when the first stories broke and the decision was made that Vince would remain head of creative, but step down as CEO, Stephanie was put in position as interim CEO by the board of directors. Levesque being head of talent relations seems to indicate that John Laurinaitis, the other executive named in these scandals, was gone for good, although no official announcement was made. Levesque had replaced Laurinaitis in that position years ago, only for Laurinaitis to replace Levesque a few years ago. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. The WWE released an 8K release covering the McMahon situation with these key points. On July 22, 2022, Vincent K. McMahon informed the company and its board of directors, the board, of his resignation from his positions as chief executive officer, chairman and director of the company, effective immediately. The company has made a preliminary determination that certain payments that Vince McMahon agreed to make during the period from 2006 through 2022, including amounts paid and payable in the future, and that were not recorded in the WWE consolidated financial statements, should have been recorded as expenses in the quarters in which those agreements were made, the unrecorded expenses. As of the date hereof, the company has identified unrecorded expenses totaling approximately $14.6 million. All payments underlying the unrecorded expenses were or will be paid by Vince McMahon personally. While the company continues to evaluate the impact on previously reported financial statements, the company has preliminarily determined that, while the amount of unrecorded expenses was not material in any individual period in which the unrecorded expenses arose, the aggregate amount of unrecorded expenses would be material if recorded entirely in the second quarter of 2022. WWE officials noted to us that, even though reading this would give you the impression that the company paid for $14.6 million, and McMahon agreed to reimburse the company that money, that McMahon had paid the money out of his own personal funds. However, since that money was part of WWE business, but not recorded as WWE business, that it should have been part of company financial statements. The money is believed to be the $12 million to 4 different women covered in the Wall Street Journal story, as well as another $2.6 million in other previously unreported cases. Accordingly, the company currently anticipates that it will revise its previously issued financial statements to record the unrecorded expenses in the applicable periods for the years ended December 31, 2019, 2020, and 2021, as well as the first quarter of 2022. When it issues its financial statements for the second quarter of 2022, the company is working with the goal of issuing such financial statements by August 9, 2022, but there is no assurance that it will be able to meet this deadline. In light of the unrecorded expenses and related facts, the company expects to conclude that its internal control over financial reporting was not effective as a result of one or more material weaknesses. The company continues to evaluate the appropriate accounting treatment for the unrecorded expenses, as well as its internal control over financial reporting, and its ultimate conclusions on these topics may differ from what the company currently anticipates. This becomes confusing in the sense that even if the money should have been part of company expenses but wasn't, and McMahon personally paid it, how would that force the company to account for that money and change its expenses totals for the past 4 years? There is still confusion over what the company is now claiming this means and what it was, and until the investigation itself is completed, as well as probes, perhaps lawsuits as well, there is still a lot more to learn about what really happened. As previously announced, a special committee of independent members of the board is conducting an investigation into alleged misconduct by Vince McMahon, which investigation remains ongoing. The company has also received, and may receive in the future, regulatory, investigative, and enforcement inquiries, subpoenas, or demands arising from, related to, or in connection with these matters. It is these inquiries that forced McMahon out. On July 22, when McMahon announced his retirement, those in the wrestling business believed that this was not final and that he could return. But a few days later, because of these investigations and problems with the accounting under his watch, the belief is that he will never return. To alleviate a feared stock price collapse with McMahon out, the company released preliminary second quarter results for the period from April 1 to June 30, showing $328 million in revenue, about $69.8 million in operating income, and $92 million in OIBDA. The second quarter of 2021, with no live events with fans other than a toned-down WrestleMania with about 20,000 fans each night, was $266 million with $46.3 million in operating income and $68.1 million OIBDA, but that wasn't the reason the stock surged, as that came because Wall Street had already seen the stock grow, with word on the street that the company could be told even prior to this. With McMahon out, the belief was that the sale would come even sooner. The official numbers will be released on August 9, the currently scheduled date of the next investors' call, where Con and Stephanie McMahon will also take questions from analysts. That is currently not on the public schedule. The company, which usually announces the date of these things weeks in advance, lists at press time that there are no events currently scheduled. The stock passed $70 per share on the sale thoughts, and was still $69.49 per share, giving the company a market value of $5.166 billion at press time on July 28. But in the hours after the market closed on July 28, after-hours trading was not good, and as of 3 hours after the market closed, the price was down to $66.70, a little above the $65.81 level the stock was at the day before McMahon's resignation was announced. McMahon being forced out meant he also had to forfeit 38,519 new shares of stock that had not fully vested, which would be worth in the range of $2.7 million. Brandon Thurston reported, in a story we were able to confirm with one person, that Senior Vice President and Assistant General Counsel James Langham sent a memo telling all WWE employees that for the time being they are not allowed to buy or sell company stock. Please be advised that, in light of recent developments, the company's trading window has closed effective immediately for all employees. Until further notice, you are prohibited from any purchases or sales of company securities. You are also instructed not to speak with others about this note. This was only for employees. Talent did not get the letter. Talent we contacted was not aware such a letter existed. For years the belief was that Levesque was establishing his team at NXT to eventually become his team when he took over the wrestling end of the business. But many of the members of that team had been fired over the past year. The two names most talked about as being replaced were Pritchard and Kevin Dunn, the head of television production. Speculation on their future has run rampant in recent days. In NXT, the belief was that the product will revert back somewhat to Levesque's previous vision of it. The belief was that while they will continue to heavily recruit top-tier athletes, a process Levesque has been a key player in over the past year, that they would be more open to use more experienced wrestling talent as well, and that going forward the door would be more open to better wrestlers who weren't as big or as good looking as McMahon wanted on the roster. But don't expect what NXT was to be the format of WWE. Levesque himself over the years had said that the NXT brand was catering to a specific audience and that the WWE major brands are different, with the idea of catering to a wider audience. His theories of how to cater to that audience would be different from McMahon, but would still be heavily influenced by the world McMahon created, since McMahon was Levesque's personal mentor in many ways for decades when it comes to creative. One person who has worked closely with McMahon for decades noted to us that the most fascinating thing to watch out for would be what happens if Vince is adamantly against something being done and has to come to grips with being powerless to change it even as the leading stockholder, and the recognition he's really out in a new direction is taking place. Still others, like Kurt Angle, have openly said that they believe Vince will still be running the company and pulling the strings. "I wasn't happy about it at all. I love Vince McMahon," said Ric Flair in an interview with Chris Van Vliet. "I don't know what he is doing right now, but I feel like he will have a hard time. He will adjust obviously, but he loved the business and he made us all who we are, from Hulk to everybody. I don't care what everybody else thinks, he made us, and I have nothing but respect for him. He is a majority stockholder. I don't know if he will stay away or not. He's a genius." There were also age issues with McMahon. You would get different viewpoints on him, but for years people had noted his memory issues, which led to forgetting segments that had been done a week or two earlier, as well as forgetting long-term storyline issues, which would frequently be changed. Fightful reported from sources in creative about meeting notes being edited to protect him for a long time, between his usage of insensitive language to calling people the wrong names to using terms that weren't socially acceptable. Announcers for years had complained about his direction, going overboard with criticism with many while the shows were in progress. Mick Foley quit the announcing position over it, and many others complained about it over the years. There are obvious questions regarding Levesque, given he's not far removed from significant heart issues. While he has recovered to where he can lead a normal life, running both talent relations and creative, of doing 5 hours of weekly television most weeks, and 8 or more hours on pay-per-view weeks, is hardly living a normal level. It is filled with incredible stress, not to mention he would be back traveling for multiple shows per week. Regarding what changes are expected to take place, what is expected is more long-term storylines, more investment in younger talent, and much less 50-50 booking. The belief was that he was more of a proponent of women's wrestling than McMahon, as shown by the changing of how women were taught to wrestle and the new style being implemented in NXT and getting over there well before it was brought to the main roster. After Levesque lost power in NXT, and they felt things had to change because of the size and age of the audience, the idea from the top was to focus more on better-looking women, and more on getting women to wear more revealing ring gear. Those changes did not result in growth most weeks nor better numbers with younger viewers. Long-term storylines were very difficult under McMahon, who was constantly changing directions and tearing up scripts. He would change things that would then change the storyline. He also had a quick trigger when it came to new talent, often expecting them to get over instantly or losing interest in them. Dewey Foley, who worked in creative until a few months ago, wrote, "Changes I hope get implemented in WWE, talent and employees feel 100% safe and comfortable going up the flagpole with any/all concerns, pitches, etc. Future signees aren't based solely off look. The more variety, the better. Long-term pitches get taken seriously and are executed." McMahon's tweet announcing his departure came 7 hours before SmackDown started on July 22 in Boston. The decision had been made days earlier but kept quiet. Virtually nobody was aware. The tweet was made 5 minutes after the close of stock trading, timed to be on a Friday on purpose, to give a few days and avoid a panic selling of stock, which, as it turned out, the opposite happened. While the Wall Street Journal pieces revealed things that had already removed him as CEO, and felt in reading that he would almost have to be out, others just felt McMahon had survived everything in 40 years and would survive this. People shouldn't have been shocked on one hand, yet it was just the latest and perhaps most final of shocks that have happened over the past month. As soon as word circulated backstage of the tweet, Brock Lesnar walked out. Details of exactly what transpired have been kept confidential. But Lesnar returned at about 8:30 p.m., more than 7 hours later, and while the show was in progress. Lesnar then participated in the show closing angle where he destroyed Theory and left him laying. Michael Cole and Pat McAfee on commentary sold it like they were shocked to see him, even though he was advertised for the show, doing that acknowledging the word that he had walked out. The belief was that when Lesnar walked out, management kept in contact with him and made a deal with him to return. Whether Lesnar was just mad at McMahon being gone, since McMahon had a special relationship with him, or some speculated that it was brilliant business on his part in reading the situation, is unknown because the only person who knows would never reveal what was in his mind when he left. Under McMahon, Lesnar pretty much did whatever he wanted since he and Roman Reigns fit Vince's parameters of what the top guys should be and look and be like, and there was nobody else like him. This was made even stronger by the knowledge Lesnar could leave any time, and McMahon greatly respected his UFC success, making him a bigger mainstream sports name. One person noted the worst thing publicly that could happen was the person considered the most famous current wrestler in the company. You could argue whether Lesnar or Ronda Rousey are the most famous, but Lesnar is the bigger star of the two right now. Walking out the day McMahon leaves and then having to change the SummerSlam main event would give the feeling that the company was in chaos just hours after McMahon was gone. It would send a terrible public message. So it was imperative for Lesnar to appear on the show. Alternate plans for the show were made without Lesnar, but he returned, and it was said that when he returned he seemed very happy, indicating whatever it took to get him back worked. The next part of the story is filled with questions. What product changes do Stephanie McMahon and Levesque go with? Who gets promoted into power? Who loses power? What becomes of the philosophy for developmental? What type of stars get pushed? What style and what booking patterns are used? What of Levesque's health? Will the SEC and federal probes uncover something that will affect the company? And how does all of this relate to the future of the wrestling business? Battles with AEW or potential relationships with other wrestling companies? McMahon had on occasion relationships with other promotions but generally did not. Tony Khan took the opposite approach in linking with as many companies as he could, whether it be New Japan, Tokyo Joshi Pro DDT, AAA, and at times with Impact. He allowed his talent to work elsewhere on days off if they wanted, which McMahon never did. There were times McMahon booked talent to other companies, including to Japan, but by the late 90s stopped doing so when financially they became so profitable the money they could make doing so became trivial. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Paul Levesque and WWE made that statement when AEW debuted to huge television ratings in its premiere episode. As 2019 was coming to a close, and NXT many times surpassed AEW in total viewers, the line was viewed one way. By 2020, when AEW won almost every week in viewers and every week in 18 to 49, the line was viewed differently. In 2021, when NXT moved from Wednesday to Tuesday, the idea was that Levesque had lost the war and the line was used to mock him. Ironically, the marathon is back up again with Levesque and Tony Khan when it comes to running creative. In a first major move, NXT is scheduling a major show on the WWE Network on September 4th, likely head-to-head with AEW All Out. The original idea for the major show, called Heatwave, was for August 13th in the usual Tuesday night time slot. An internal memo from WWE listed that day but didn't list the starting time. It is possible, but unlikely, they would avoid the head-to-head by doing an afternoon show. The WWE show would be easier access since it's free, or part of a $4.99 package that a large percentage of fans already have. WWE previously ran an Evolve major show head-to-head with AEW in 2019. The Evolve show was considered a success and people claimed it was just coincidental and had been planned for that date, even though it was announced after AEW announced. With the benefit of hindsight, given WWE never ran another Evolve special before the company closed in 2020, it seems most likely the move was to hurt the AEW show. One major advantage Tony Khan had was the industry's knowledge that Vince McMahon had a very limited mindset of who could be a top star. Many smaller wrestlers knew they'd never make it in WWE. Some also went there without the WWE look and body, thinking with success in NXT that it would change. In time the realization was it wouldn't change. A key aspect is if that dynamic changes. Exactly how this change affects AEW is another of the biggest questions going forward. What was thought to be the most important news story of the next few years, if AEW is able to secure a stronger paying television deal that guarantees its profitability and ability to bid for more top stars, was usurped by McMahon's leaving. Levesque will clearly be intense in bidding for top AEW talent when their deals expire. Conversely, Tony Khan would be the same. The top talent will benefit from this. But unless AEW secures a better paying television deal, they would be far more limited in this free agent market without risking major losses. Levesque will not have that issue. I've got people signed here for 5 years and people think that just because the CEO, chairman, head of creative, those people changed in the competition, people I have 5-year contracts with are going to magically switch teams? Good luck with that. With Levesque and Michaels being close, the cohesion between developmental and the main roster will almost certainly get better. One would expect NXT talent being brought up to get a longer time period to get over rather than often getting their legs cut off quickly when McMahon would make an immediate decision that they aren't stars. There will likely still be plenty of people who won't make it. But one would think they'll get more time to catch on and not be beaten and established as non-top stars immediately. The advantage is WWE has when it comes to tenure and revenue will make it number one for the foreseeable future. That doesn't preclude WWE from falling in popularity, as was happening until the ship started steadying. AEW was gaining in popularity and in house show attendance, popularity of major events and 18 to 49 ratings, particularly with men, even with all WWE's advantages. The landscape was very competitive. As of just recently, and going forward, the gap has grown in WWE's favor. If AEW gets a substantial increase in its next deal, and keeps its popularity at a solid level, it will be fine. But that's far from a sure thing. That battle for the fan base remains a major story, but the dynamic for AEW changes with Vince McMahon out of the picture. For WWE, they are simply too profitable, and the belief is that Levesque will never make the kind of mistakes WCW did when it came to creative that took it down. The next big stories are a potential WWE sale and AEW's next. This is the end of this conversion. Be sure to comment and subscribe. See you next time.